In week one, we talked specifically about openings and the importance of paying attention to your opening, going back and giving it a rewrite if needed. And most of the time, when it comes to an opening, once we've actually drafted our full manuscript, we have a better idea of what our story is about. So we can develop probably what would be a stronger opening if we went back to it and started from scratch. Now we can pretty much apply something very similar to revisiting the early chapters of our book as well. For when I wrote Relationship in the Green, I found that my writing flowed so much more smoothly once I was out of those opening chapters. I had an idea of what the shape of my story was, what framework I was writing within, and I was able to take that narrative forward. And it showed when I reread those sections. I felt myself developing as a more competent writer within those sections. When the characters had already been introduced, I could just let the narrative fly. What I found was within those opening chapters, there was so much more hard work going on, and it was noticeable. It was a bit of a slog to read in those first drafts. There was so much in the opening that I was throwing in, trying to tell my reader that this was going to be important, that was going to be important, that it didn't flow, it didn't go well, it didn't kind of sing. It just all sounded a bit too clinical, so to speak, from lesson two. So when it comes to revisiting these opening pages, I think it's just really important to have in mind what your story actually is and whether a lot of that information is now needed. Now, the example that we use is David Nichols's Sweet Sorrow, which is a lovely novel, but David himself said that originally in the first draft, the first 50 pages focused on his main character's childhood and family dynamics, rather than actually the story that he wanted to tell. And though there was so much of it that he still loved, when he went back, he found that he needed to cut the whole of those 50 pages because it just wasn't relevant to the proper story. He managed to weave that information elsewhere in the novel, but those first pages weren't essentially needed. And in the redrafting process, you may find that as well. Later in this lesson, we're going to talk about gaps and what gaps there are that need to be filled in. And once you've written the first draft, you're going to be really pleased with it. But what you're going to notice is the fact that so much has happened in the writing process that your characters have become more fully formed in your head, that you have more of an idea of a direction to take your story, or you've taken your story in a slightly different direction than you've originally plotted. If you read your manuscript with a bit of a objective lens, you'll probably notice that you have characters who have no outside friendships. You have characters who only exist to serve the main character. And we need to then go back to the concept of the novel, that with a novel, you're writing something that has never happened, but feels like it has, that it feels real. So when you're going through your manuscript, pay attention to what could be mini gaps in the plot, mini gaps in the characterization. For example, do your characters mention their family? Do you know if your character's mother is alive or dead? And do they have conversations? Is it relevant? Are there certain bits that just feel that, oh, this is slightly underdeveloped? In my own writing, I just found that with the backstory I set out for my characters, I noticed that they never talked about a common interest. One was a publisher, one was a bookseller, and they never talked about books. And to be honest, that doesn't make sense. So look out for those gaps in the narrative and figure out how to plug them, so to speak. And that could then really be applied by going back to those opening chapters and figuring out, are they needed? Or if they are needed, are there any gaps that are obvious that we need to kind of fill in and kind of craft so we've got a more fully formed manuscript that sits well compared to a comparable novel already out in the real world? Can you take the advice of David and pinpoint where your novel really starts? Is it where you've originally penned, or is it somewhere else? Is there something more meaningful? Can you determine what you need to cut to actually bring the story closer to what will be more interesting to the reader, what is more reflective to the actual story that you're trying to tell, the one that's really important to you?